The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of expensive conversations filled the private room of the exclusive club. Adrian Vale, CEO of Vale Enterprises, leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips. His business partner, Weston Hale, had just laid down a ridiculous challenge. Weston wagered that Adrian could not take a woman from the bottom rung of society, marry her on paper, and pass her off as a high society bride at the upcoming global merger gala. The prize was a controlling share in a subsidiary they both coveted. Adrian, fueled by his usual arrogance and an insatiable need to win, accepted the bet without a second thought. To him, people were just variables in an equation, easily bought and manipulated. The next morning, an incredibly vague but high-paying advertisement for a temporary companion contract was posted. Sienna Hayes, currently working a grueling double shift as a waitress in a diner, saw the ad. She was tired, her feet ached, and she needed the funds to secure a quiet, independent life far away from her past. When she walked into the towering glass and steel building of Vale Enterprises for the interview, she was acutely aware of her faded jeans and worn sneakers among the sea of designer suits. Adrian was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk when she entered. He expected someone timid, eager to please, and easily intimidated by his wealth. Instead, Sienna met his cold gaze with a fiery independence that immediately threw him off balance. When he slid the absurd marriage contract across the desk, outlining strict rules and a massive payout, she did not flinch. She simply picked up a pen, pointed out a restrictive clause about her personal freedom, demanded it be removed, and signed it. Adrian watched her, intrigued by her defiance. He noticed the elegant, almost practiced way she held the pen, a subtle detail that did not match her worn waitress uniform. The wedding was a brief, sterile affair in a judge's chambers. There were no flowers, no vows of love, just the scratching of pens on legal documents. Sienna moved into Adrian's sprawling penthouse, but she immediately established her boundaries. When Adrian sent an assistant with a rack of thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes, Sienna politely turned them away. She told Adrian that she was a hired bride for a gala, not a doll to be dressed up for his amusement. She purchased a simple, elegant dress from a thrift store and tailored it herself. Adrian was furious at first, accustomed to women who leaped at his generosity, but her refusal sparked a strange respect in him. Weston, observing them during a brief visit to the penthouse, watched Sienna with narrow, calculating eyes, sensing that this waitress was not going to break as easily as he had hoped. Living together brought a steady rhythm of friction and unexpected understanding. They clashed constantly over his rigid, empty lifestyle. During a heated argument in his sleek, minimalist kitchen, Sienna told him that for all his millions, his life was completely devoid of warmth, a hollow fortress where no one actually cared about him. The words struck a nerve, leaving a lingering silence between them, yet there were moments of quiet shifting. When an arrogant foreign investor insulted Sienna at a preliminary dinner, assuming she was just a pretty face, Adrian stepped in, fiercely defending her intellect and shutting the investor down. That night, sitting on the balcony overlooking the city lights, they shared a rare moment of vulnerability. Sienna spoke vaguely about the heavy cost of living under family expectations, and Adrian found himself genuinely listening, the lines of their contract blurring as real attraction took root. The turning point came when Sienna fell ill with a sudden, severe fever. The ever-controlling Adrian Vale cancelled 2 crucial board meetings to stay by her side. He clumsily made her tea, bringing her cool cloths, shedding his corporate armor. In the quiet haze of her fever, Sienna murmured things about a trust fund, about running away from a golden cage, and about the crushing weight of a family name she despised. Adrian pieced the fragments together. He hired a private investigator not to ruin her, but out of a sudden, desperate need to protect the woman he was falling for. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Sienna was not just a waitress. She was the sole missing heiress to the massive Hayes fortune, a woman who had walked away from billions to escape a deeply toxic, manipulative family. The revelation made Adrian feel an intense wave of guilt over the shallow bet that had brought them together. Unable to confess his own shameful secret about the bet, Adrian withdrew. He grew cold and distant, punishing himself and inadvertently punishing her. The silence in the penthouse became suffocating. Instead of grand gestures, he tried to bridge the gap in small, quiet ways. He would leave her favorite blend of dark roast coffee brewing in the morning, or place a single, unpretentious daisy on the counter without a note. Sienna noticed these quiet apologies, her heart softening, but the unspoken tension remained a wall between them. Meanwhile, Weston Hale was ready to strike. Realizing that Adrian was actually falling in love and might cancel the bet, Weston decided to destroy him completely. Weston planned to hijack the upcoming merger gala, intending to expose the bet to the entire board, painting Adrian as a reckless, cruel gambler, unfit to lead the new combined empire. He wanted to humiliate Sienna and force the board to oust Adrian, leaving Weston in charge. The night of the gala arrived, brilliant and ruthless. Sienna stood by Adrian, looking breathtaking in her simple tailored dress, outshining the diamonds around them. Just as the main speeches began, Weston took the stage. With a cruel smile, he announced the bet to the room, projecting the original wager contract onto the massive screens. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Adrian froze, looking at Sienna with absolute terror, waiting for her to run. But Sienna did not run. She stepped forward, her posture radiating absolute authority. Reaching into her clutch, she pulled out a flash drive and handed it to the audio-visual technician. New documents flashed onto the screen. Sienna spoke into the microphone, her voice steady and commanding. She introduced herself not as a waitress, but as Sienna Hayes. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the wealthy elite recognized the lost heiress, but she wasn't finished. The documents on the screen detailed Weston Hale's systematic embezzlement and his secret meetings with rival companies to sabotage Vale Enterprises. She had used her quiet, observant weeks in the penthouse to gather the very data Weston had carelessly left unsecured in the Home Office. Weston turned pale, stammering as security guards approached the stage. The investors turned their backs on him in disgust, his own ambition becoming his noose. He was escorted out of the building, humiliated, ruined, and stripped of all his shares. The silence that followed was profound. Adrian found Sienna on the terrace, away from the chaos. The cool night air blew between them. He did not offer excuses. He offered a raw, unvarnished apology. He admitted that he had started this as an arrogant fool, but that she had completely dismantled his cold world, teaching him what it actually meant to care for someone. He asked for nothing, only her forgiveness. Sienna looked at the man who had traded his pride to take care of her when she was sick, the man who had defended her honor. She stepped close, closing the distance between them, and told him that the contract was void, but they could start over, this time on their own terms. Months passed, and the cold penthouse was transformed into a home filled with warmth and life. Adrian and Sienna stood side by side, not just as lovers, but as equal partners, having successfully merged their lives and visions to build a foundation that helped young entrepreneurs from difficult backgrounds. They had found true wealth, not in their bank accounts, but in the unwavering trust they shared. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with the next stories. See you next time. The heavy oak doors of the attorney's office swung shut, leaving Julian Ashford in a suffocating silence. The CEO of Ashford Group had just been handed an ultimatum from beyond the grave. His late father's will contained a bizarre ironclad clause stating that Julian had to marry within 30 days and remain married for a year, or forfeit his controlling shares to the board, which was firmly in the pocket of his controlling classist mother, Clarissa. Julian despised being manipulated, but losing the empire he had built was out of the question. He needed a wife on paper, someone invisible, someone who understood a transaction and would not demand his heart. Later that evening, the sprawling marble lobby of the Ashford building was empty, save for the night receptionist. Margot Ellis was organizing a stack of misfiled documents when Julian stormed through the revolving doors, his temper visibly fraying. He barked an order at her to summon his driver immediately. Instead of scrambling in panic like most of his employees, Margot calmly finished sorting her files, met his furious gaze, and informed him that his driver had clocked out 10 minutes ago per Julian's own revised corporate policy. Julian paused, genuinely surprised. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was composed, unapologetic, and completely unimpressed by his wealth. In that split second, the cold gears in his mind turned. He offered her a life-altering sum of money right there in the empty lobby, laying out the terms of a fake marriage. Margot let out a dry laugh, calling his proposal the most arrogant thing she had ever heard, but a shadow crossed her face. The money was exactly what she needed. She agreed, but made it clear she was a contractor, not a conquest. Their wedding was a sterile exchange of signatures at the city hall, devoid of any warmth or celebration. The moment Margot stepped into Julian's opulent, lifeless mansion, his mother, Clarissa, was waiting. Clarissa looked Margot up and down with barely concealed disgust, making sharp, cruel remarks about her simple clothes and working-class background. Margot did not shrink back. She smiled politely and told Clarissa that true elegance was not something that could be bought with a credit card, leaving the older woman speechless. When Julian tried to give Margot a diamond necklace the next day to wear for the cameras, she handed it back. She told him to keep his jewels for someone who actually cared about his money, asserting her fierce independence. As days turned into weeks, the forced proximity began to chip away at their armor. They clashed constantly. Margot challenged his ruthless business tactics, pointing out the human cost of his relentless expansion. Julian, in turn, was infuriated by her stubborn refusal to enjoy the luxuries he provided, yet an undeniable attraction simmered beneath their arguments. One evening, exhausted after a grueling press tour, Julian found Margot asleep on the library sofa, with a book on corporate law resting on her chest. Without waking her, he gently placed a warm blanket over her shoulders. It was a tiny, silent gesture of care that he would never admit to, but Margot, half awake, felt the unexpected tenderness. The fragile peace shattered during a high-profile charity dinner. Clarissa, desperate to break the marriage, had hired investigators and smugly cornered them in the hallway. She sneered, asking Julian if he knew who his little bride really was. In the tense silence, Margot stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. She did not let Clarissa control the narrative. Margot confessed the truth herself. Her last name was Ellis, the same family whose manufacturing company Julian had ruthlessly acquired and dismantled 5 years ago, bankrupting her father and destroying her family's legacy. She had taken the receptionist job just to survive the financial ruin he had caused. The revelation hit Julian like a freight train. He saw the profound pain in her eyes, a pain he was directly responsible for. He had always viewed that acquisition as just another line on a spreadsheet, never considering the lives crushed beneath it. The guilt was suffocating. An icy rift formed between them. Margot retreated into silence, her walls fully rebuilt. Julian did not try to win her back with empty apologies or expensive gifts. Instead, he began working late into the night, quietly restructuring his own holding company. He started leaving her favorite roasted almonds on the kitchen counter, and he explicitly banned his mother from setting foot in the house, a silent vow to protect Margot from further harm. But Clarissa was not finished. Furious at being banished, she orchestrated a massive corporate coup. She called an emergency board meeting inviting the press. Her plan was to present a fabricated dossier claiming Margot was a corporate spy stealing Ashford Group secrets. Hoping the scandal would annul the marriage and trigger the will's penalty clause, handing the company to Clarissa. As the board gathered, whispers filled the boardroom. Clarissa stood up, waving the forged dossier triumphantly, ready to destroy Margot publicly. But Julian was already 2 steps ahead. He walked into the room, calm and lethal, with Margot by his side. Julian ignored his mother's ranting and projected his own documents onto the main screen. The files were not about Margot. They were a detailed, undeniable record of Clarissa's systematic embezzlement from the company's pension fund over the last decade. The room erupted in shock. Julian systematically dismantled his mother's power, watching as the board members turned their backs on her one by one. Clarissa, stripped of her titles, her reputation, and her wealth, was escorted out of the building by security, utterly humiliated. With the threat gone, Julian turned to Margot in front of the empty boardroom. He did not boast about the victory. Instead, he handed her a thick leather folder. Inside were the deeds and patents of her father's old company, fully restored and legally transferred back to her name. He apologized genuinely, not just for the arrogance of their contract, but for the blind ambition that had hurt her family. He told her she was free to go, but admitted that she had brought a soul to his empty life. Margot looked at the documents, tears pricking her eyes, and then looked at Julian. The cold, calculating CEO was gone, replaced by a man who had finally learned the value of a heart. She reached out, taking his hand, and told him she didn't want to run the company alone. Years later, the towering skyscrapers of the Ashford Group were a distant memory. Julian had stepped down as CEO, leaving the corporate warfare behind. Together, he and Margot relocated to a quiet coastal town, rebuilding her family's business from the ground up, focused on sustainable, ethical practices. They traded the cold luxury of penthouses for the warm breeze of the ocean, finding a wealth far more profound than any inheritance could offer. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of redemption and love. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with the next stories. See you next time. The flashes of paparazzi cameras illuminated the rainy streets outside the Kane Global headquarters. Inside his penthouse office, Sebastian Kane stared down at the sprawling city with a jaw carved from granite. He was hours away from securing a massive international shipping merger, but the conservative overseas investors had one archaic stipulation. They refused to do business with a known playboy. They wanted a family man, a pillar of stability. Sebastian's public relations team had scrambled, presenting him with a stack of portfolios containing high society women willing to play the part of a devoted fiancé for a price. Sebastian hated being cornered, but he loved winning more. He demanded they find someone outside his circle, someone who wouldn't cling to him once the ink was dry. The next afternoon, Vivian Reed sat in the sterile waiting room of a high-end, discreet companionship agency. She was not a socialite. She was a former architecture student who desperately needed a massive sum of money, and she needed it fast. When she was ushered into the private meeting room, Sebastian was already there, looking at his watch with blatant impatience. He expected a sycophant. Instead, Vivian sat across from him, her posture rigid and her eyes devoid of any starstruck wonder. When he laid out the rules of their temporary engagement, demanding absolute obedience in public, Vivian leaned forward. She told him that she would play his adoring partner for the cameras, but behind closed doors, he had no authority over her. She demanded a strict schedule and a penalty fee if he wasted her time. Sebastian was taken aback, his pride bristling, but a spark of genuine amusement cut through his irritation. He signed the check. The transition into his world of unfathomable wealth was immediate and jarring. Vivian was moved into a guest wing of his sprawling estate. The first major test was a weekend retreat with the investors. Sebastian's staff tried to dress Vivian in heavy, ostentatious diamonds, but she flatly refused. She told Sebastian that she was there to play a sophisticated partner, not a walking chandelier. She chose a simple, unbranded silk gown that she carried with quiet dignity. Across the ballroom, Sebastian's bitter ex-fiancée, Delphine Cross, watched them with venomous eyes. Delphine had always believed she would be the one to share Sebastian's throne, and she immediately sensed that something about this sudden engagement was entirely fabricated. Living in close quarters, the friction between Sebastian and Vivian crackled like electricity. He was obsessed with control, and she refused to yield. During a quiet evening in the library, Vivian looked around at the cold, untouchable art and told him that his entire life was a beautifully curated museum where nothing was actually alive. The observation stung deeply, exposing a truth he usually buried in work. Yet the walls between them began to crack when Delphine cornered Vivian at a luncheon, throwing thinly veiled insults about her unknown background. Sebastian materialized at Vivian's side. He wrapped an arm around her waist, his voice dropping to a dangerous register as he warned Delphine to step away from his future wife. It was meant to be a performance, but the protective fire in his chest felt dangerously real. The turning point happened when Vivian nearly collapsed after a long charity gala. She brushed it off as fatigue, but Sebastian noticed the pale shade of her skin and the slight tremor in her hands. Driven by a mix of suspicion and an unfamiliar protective instinct, he hired his best private investigator to look into her background. The file was delivered the next morning, and it shattered his entire world. Vivian was not just struggling financially, she was hiding a severe degenerative heart condition, and the exorbitant fee from their contract was the exact amount needed for an experimental, life-saving surgery abroad. Sebastian felt a crushing wave of guilt. He had dragged a critically ill woman through a grueling schedule of parties and press tours just to pad his own ego and bank account. He could not bring himself to confront her, paralyzed by his own shame. Instead, a silent punishment settled over him. He became distant, cancelling their public appearances under the guise of being too busy. But in the shadows, his actions shifted entirely. He fired the agency, voiding the contract, and quietly bought a controlling stake in the hospital, where she was scheduled for surgery to ensure she received the best surgeons in the world. He started making sure her favorite soothing teas were always hot and waiting for her, and he kept the estate perfectly quiet so she could sleep. Vivian felt the shift. The cold billionaire had suddenly become a phantom protector, and her own carefully guarded heart began to ache with genuine affection for him. Delphine, however, had not been idle. She had paid off a disgruntled staff member from the companionship agency and obtained a copy of Vivian's original file. Delphine planned her strike for the final merger celebration, inviting the press and the conservative investors. She intended to announce that Sebastian's perfect fiancée was a paid escort and a sickly liability, destroying his deal and his reputation in one swift motion. The ballroom was packed when Delphine took the microphone, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she began to speak about honesty and corporate integrity. She pulled out the agency documents, but before she could read a single word, Sebastian stepped forward, taking Vivian's hand. He did not let Delphine control the room. Sebastian looked directly at the investors and the cameras. He announced that there would be no merger. He declared that he was stepping down from the negotiations effective immediately because the only thing that mattered to him was the health and safety of the woman he loved. He exposed Delphine's cruelty, detailing how she had tried to weaponize a woman's medical condition for corporate leverage. The room turned on Delphine instantly. The wealthy elite and the investors muttered in disgust, stepping away from her. Delphine lost the respect of every ally in the room, her social standing evaporating in seconds as she was escorted away in disgrace. In the quiet aftermath, Sebastian took Vivian out to the deserted gardens. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. He dropped all his arrogant defenses. He confessed that the contract meant nothing anymore, and that he was terrified of losing her. He asked for the privilege to stand by her side, not as an employer, but as a man who wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure her heart kept beating. Vivian looked at the powerful man who had given up an empire to protect her secret. She reached up, resting her hand against his chest, and told him that she didn't need a contract to stay. Months later, the hospital rooms and corporate battles were a thing of the past. Vivian was fully recovered, her laughter filling the once empty halls of the Kane estate. They were truly married now, and as Sebastian held her close in the nursery they had just finished painting, they looked forward to the arrival of their first child, building a legacy of warmth and love that no amount of money could ever buy. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of redemption and love. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with the next stories. See you next time.
Editor. The infographic shows that these 3 stories are not simply fantasies about billionaires falling in love with ordinary women. At their core, they are stories about power, dignity, emotional healing, and becoming worthy of another person's trust. Adrian, Julian, and Sebastian begin from positions of control. They are wealthy and accustomed to making decisions without considering the emotional cost to others. Marriage and affection are treated as business tools. Contracts replace intimacy, money replaces sincerity, and status becomes a shield against vulnerability. The women challenged this system from the beginning. Sienna, Margot, and Vivian refuse to behave like passive figures rescued by rich men. Each woman establishes boundaries, protects her independence, and forces the man beside her to confront truths he would rather ignore. Their strength is shown through self-respect. They reject gifts when those gifts are used as instruments of control, and they insist on being treated as partners rather than possessions. This exposes how class prejudice causes wealthy people to underestimate waitresses, receptionists, and women without visible status. The psychological transformation begins when control is no longer enough. Illness, guilt, hidden identities, and public humiliation break the emotional armor of the male characters. Adrian discovers that Sienna escaped a powerful family and realizes how cruel his bet was. Julian learns that his business decisions destroyed Margot's family, forcing him to see the human consequences behind corporate success. Sebastian understands that Vivian accepted the arrangement because she was fighting for her life. In every case, love begins only after the man experiences shame, fear, and responsibility. The infographic emphasizes that redemption cannot be achieved through speeches alone. Trust is rebuilt through consistent actions. A cup of coffee, an act of protection, the return of a stolen legacy, or the decision to abandon a profitable merger becomes more meaningful than luxury. These gestures show that care is real when it requires sacrifice. The men become believable partners only when they stop protecting their image and begin protecting another person's dignity. Each story follows a similar emotional path. A transactional relationship creates conflict. A hidden truth changes the balance of power. A public crisis forces a moral choice. Finally, the relationship becomes genuine only after both people stand beside each other freely. The villains represent corruption, manipulation, class cruelty, and the abuse of family or corporate power. Their defeat brings justice, but the deeper victory is internal. The protagonists learn that wealth without empathy creates isolation, while love built on honesty creates belonging. This is why these stories resonate. They offer the fantasy of luxury, but their real promise is emotional. They suggest that people can change, that dignity can survive humiliation, and that love becomes valuable only when it is chosen without pressure. The true wealth in these narratives is not money or influence. It is the ability to be seen completely, forgiven honestly, and loved as an equal.